Thank you, Hedy, for that generous remark. And I really do feel I'm the lucky one. I'm the lucky one to have the privilege to study this music. And this is only my fourth time actually visiting Vancouver. So Vancouver is very special to me, and you will see why. So in 2005, I was browsing through the UBC Chang collection online, and I stumbled onto this picture. And the feeling I can't quite explain to you, but I can only say I feel she's waiting for me there all this time. Because in that particular collection that has this picture, it was anonymous, just like nothing was, prescribed to her. But I know she's waiting for me because I know her, and I've never seen a picture like her, like this of her, but I know of her. I know her performance. I know where she's been to in North America. I follow her steps in trying to figure out what, she's done. And so that's her. The one on the right hand, the second from the right, that's her. She's singing in this performance, and we don't quite know what this was, but you can tell from the performance and the wardrobe that it was substantial. And she's here. She's the second from the left, and this is a famous opera. It's about Pan Jinlian. So she's playing this woman who's been led away because suspected that she killed her husband. And she's also here. She's there in this kind of warrior play, right? And these were all pictures of stage performances from San Francisco in 1920s. And as you can see, I saw her on stage in all sorts of pictures, but I never saw one that's as beautiful as the one that she had, like that, portrait. And it was an amazing moment for me to see her in her true self. And another thing that's really important for that picture for me is that I know when some collection would have a picture like her, a picture like that of her, it means that the community treasure her, right? So she's not only someone on stage, performing, but she's someone who was adored by the community. And that's why that particular performance, particular picture was really stunning to me. And I really love that. And therefore I know that Vancouver is a place where I would trace her, because I have this strong feeling that when she was in San Francisco and performing in those, in those beautiful stage, she was there after she's been somewhere else first. And that Vancouver picture was the place that she began. So that's her name. Her name is Guan Yingling. And you can see on this really phenomenal picture that she was actually truly adored. On the very top, you can see that this is kind of decoration that has actually her name encircled in two things. And then in the middle, that's her. And that's whole range of performers showing her in this particular role. And that was the troupe that's called Le Wan Nian that Emily had shown us about. And this was a picture from 1922. It was a very important picture, and you can imagine the community had such respect, not only for her, but also for the troupe that was, so grand, right? And I must say, Chinese community, it should be very proud to have this picture, because I've never encountered anything like this in my research. This is just gorgeous, and it's in Chang collection. So from this picture, can you already tell there was a lively Chinese theaters in 1920s, right? There's a whole group of people who perform at the top, most professional level, and there's a group of people who, bring them all the way across from China to perform in North America. And in Vancouver, they were given such, kind of adoration, and so on and so forth. So this really just impressed, I think, anyone. You look at the top, you can see these are all banners that praises the troupe and that have great significance. It was an important community event. So this is a theater that that was actually the location where the troupe was performing, and it's formerly called the Imperial Theater. And this actually was the exact picture of 1921. So I imagine they must have transformed this theater into a Chinese theater, and we have proof of that. So before I move on to talk more about that, I want to just show you that there's a lot of performances like this that were pictured. And as we know, picture in 1920 was very difficult. So they took a lot of time to stage everybody and then to have exposure and to, show that. So there's a lot of community support for the theater and a lot of people who, spend a lot of effort to make this exciting night after night. That is to say, they don't just repeat the repertoire and play for 3 days. No, they don't do anything like that. They put on one of these, and then they put on another one like this. And this, as you can see, you can probably see there's an airplane at the top, right? And there's at the bottom, there's people who are, I guess, taking different stands, right? At that time, Vancouver was very politically, the community was very politically kind of in contradiction. They have different camps, so on and so forth. Okay, I want to show you this picture as well because I've been talking about this in the past 2 days, in that they didn't just, portray the traditional stuff. They also have fancy stuff. They were influenced by Hollywood and also the pictures that were part of the kind of things they want to experiment, right? So this is a combination of these traditional people in the Ming Dynasty kind of wardrobe as well as this. It's just fascinating. So with that introduction, I think you can see where I'm coming from. I'm here to share with you the genealogy and the story of Chinese theaters in North America. And that 1920s was an exciting moment, and I'll tell you why. But I want to just lay out the various areas in which that Chinese opera theater was, an important force of the culture in the Chinese community. The first is the Chinese theaters from 1852 to around 1950s. During this time, they're what I call the professional theater, in that they perform every night. And if they have the means, they will publish playbills every night, and so on and so forth. And that's the period in which they really perform really sustain theaters that, sit thousands and thousands of people. And the second time is the situation where they actually are featured in world fairs, right? So in various different world fairs, especially one, the Columbia Exposition in Chicago, it was very famous in how Chinese theater was, important part of it. And the next one is Mei Fang, who's actually a Peking opera performer. What we have talked about so far are Cantonese opera. But Mei Fang was actually Peking opera performers, and this is one of the most high-profile performance I should say, Chinese actor on Broadway, right? So basically, he conquered Broadway, and then went to also San Francisco, and then went to LA and received honorary degree. So the next one I want to say is that after 1950s, there are actually no professional theaters anymore. Why? Because there's a lot of other entertainment, right? However, I want to make the claim that Cantonese opera, in particular, still was very, very influential in the Chinese community. Why? Because they come in as films. I've interviewed many people who grew up in Chinatown, in the 50s, and that's what they do. They go to theater and they watch these Cantonese opera films. So those are very important. And another way of continue this Cantonese opera performance is actually in the opera club. So people have, amateur who like to sing, and then they perform periodically, and they also host professional troupes to come to the United States to perform. The last one, as Gloria has mentioned, Chinese Music Association is very important as well, because the instrumental music is closely related to Cantonese opera. In fact, the accompanying musician for the Cantonese opera were typically leaders of this Chinese ensemble, and they actually became more and more important as time went on. Okay, so this I lay out for you the various different influences of that constitute this 170 years. Today, however, I'm going to focus on the first one because I have a lot of story to tell there. And with some time we do have at the end, I'll also show you some Cantonese opera films. So at the beginning, as you know, in 1852, there's this big group of Chinese immigrants come to North America, and as you can see at that time, from China to San Francisco or to the British Columbia is a lot closer than it is from New York, going around the south to come up here. And therefore, Cantonese migration become very, very lively because they become the main source for a lot of materials that California needed for build its nation. It's a lot cheaper to get it across the Trans-Pacific than going the other way. So these are the places where the Cantonese came, and they were very interestingly situated in this area because they are the very good experienced people who know how to deal with foreigners, and they also have the means, in some ways, to gather enough money to buy tickets to send people overseas. So these were the Trans-Pacific network that was allowing people to go across the Pacific and become part of the California community. And as soon as the community started to establish, immediately the Chinese troupe came. And here is the first troupe that we have knowledge about, and it's called Hong Fu Tang in Chinese. But in English, it has a lot of different ways of spelling this. And for those of you who might be able to read this in some detail, you will see that it's a standard repertoire that's performed in the Cantonese opera kind of the kind of opera you perform on the first day of you premiere in a place. These are the typical performances, typical opera. One of them is called 六国风相, right? And they have a lot of important roles and costumes that they present themselves in the most glorious way ever possible. Another important thing to remember about this, as you probably can't quite tell, is that this whole troupe has 123 people. So to bring a troupe of 123 members, it takes a lot of money. In fact, they almost, occupy the whole troupe, whole vessel that bring them over. The whole vessel brings something like 156 people, and 123 of them were the performers. And many people don't know of these three people, okay? But they tell us a lot about this Cantonese opera troupe. And that is because they were actually important people. They were not just anybody. They were leaders. They were trained in the missionary school. They're bilingual. And so a lot of these people, especially Norman Yat-Sen, came as early as 1850 and was very high profile in engaging with the community. They organized all sorts of parades to celebrate, for example, Washington's birthday, or to celebrate July 4th. So we have records of Norman Yat-Sen being one of the Chinese leaders that participated in those important events. And this second one is a graduate from Morrison School, and he spent some time in the United States and then went back to China and become one of the most powerful people who engage with various different kind of trades and situations. And there were also people, these leaders who brought Chinese opera troupe over, were also the people who stand up to forward the community to the mainstream political situation. So when anti-Chinese sentiment start to rise and they start to have, different ways of just kind of targeting Chinese immigrants and so on and so forth, these are the people who spoke up to the government at the time and say, you cannot do this to us. This doesn't go along with your founding principle of the United States, and so on and so forth. So they were powerful people. So I think it's really important for us to remember, perhaps, that at that time, the powerful people in the Chinese community want to have Chinese theater in North America, because it's a way to help them expand their influence, to show the culture, right, and to impress, indeed, of the people who are probably, have much less civilization than Chinese, right? They're proud. So for a whole week, that Hong Fu Tang troupe performed, and they put on advertise every single day in the newspaper. And as we have the record now, they play different things every night. And not only in California that they know about this, New York also reported about, hey, there's a Chinese troupe in San Francisco, right? So they were all kind of paying attention to the Chinese troupe actually in North America. So it was a big event for everybody. However, it's hard for us to study these Chinese theaters. Why? Because their names are very, very different. Depends on who's writing the reports, right? So these are the different spelling of that particular troupe that I can find in the newspaper. I'm sure this is not all. So for anyone who wants to do this study, you actually really have to dig and have to, have the imagination to think how to do it. But this just gives you a kind of funny way of showing how they can be all different. Another important point I always like to bring people to think about is that at the time in San Francisco, there's almost no opera production. Imagine, it was expensive for them to bring opera production, right? So all they have, for the most part, were performance of one singer, two or three, right? Or two or three kind of people for English drama. It was nothing huge. So Hong Fu Tang began his performance in San Francisco in 1852, and that was only a year and a half after the first fully produced European opera that was performed in San Francisco. And in fact, 1882 was a year that there was not a single European opera produced in San Francisco. And so these Cantonese opera troupes that has 123 people, imagine, 123 people on stage and then the instruments, right? They have such a showing, and the theater space, we were just talking to another historian that tell us it's actually 2,000 seats, right? So it was a big splash, and it was really significant event. Okay, so they didn't stay in San Francisco. They were attracted by a contract by a manager, and who took them across the South and on the boat, under one of the ship, and then go to New York to perform. And they perform at this place that's called Needle Garden, right? So unfortunately, that was not a good move for them, because the person who was the then manager that brought them over was American, and then cheated them and then took their money, or took whatever the money and then ran. So it was not a successful event. However, it doesn't stop, the opera to continue to exist in America. And that's because there's demand. So at that time, the mining country has a lot of Chinese who were, not only digging gold, but also, building the agricultural development and also do the forest kind of work and doing a lot of fishing, kind of so on and so forth. So these are all the places that I shown here that have indication of ever hosted Chinese theaters. So Chinese theaters were built actually in these places, and sometimes they were performing in the theater of already existed. But if the place doesn't have a theater, no problem, they build one, and that's very lively and important. And these are all the cities. All the towns in the inner part of California, Northern California. They call them mother lode, right? That actually had Chinese theaters present, and you can see that it's numerous, and it was very interesting way of thinking about, because I think it's very interesting to think about, because in China they perform that way a lot. They perform along the river to the different villages. So for them to come and perform that way in North America, it was nothing new, really. So at the same time, when they are performing in the inner city, interior of California, they also continue to appear on different stages in San Francisco. And this is one of the ones. As you can see, this is the McGuire Theater that was very famous around that time, and they have like a feature like this. And then there's another one at Metropolitan Theater, and it also has troupes that perform in a very prominent way. These are not long performances. Actually, I suspect that they actually perform in Chinese community regularly. And then this, San Francisco theater also want their presence, so they would contract them to perform in these larger audiences, larger space for the American audience, right? So they kind of going back and forth. So as you can see, this is what I'm talking about. 1867 was still the time when we don't have one Chinese theater devoted to only, Cantonese opera. But we do have the city directory, a mentioning of 2 Chinese theaters in 2 particular locations. Okay? And so it goes to show that in addition to the mining towns, in addition to the San Francisco large theaters, they also have different locations that continue to perform. We don't know a lot about them because they don't show up in newspapers. However, in 1869, something big happened, and that is the completion of transnational railroad, right? Transcontinental Railroad. And after this railroad was completed, it was not actually really complete because it only go as far as Sacramento. But at least there's a way for people from the east to take the train and go all the way, and then basically overcome all those difficult lands of Rocky Mountain and can arrive at Sacramento. And that means they have a way to see what's happening in California, which was mystery for the rest of the country. And so after that, then they start to see that Chinese theaters were really important part of the San Francisco community. So the first Chinese theater that was built exclusively for Cantonese opera was built in 1868. And so as soon as the railroad is built, the theater show up in the magazine in this one wood engraving. And as you can imagine, we have very important Chinese community leaders, and they were very engaged in making more Chinese theaters. So the first theater was 1868. You don't really need to remember this. 1868, and then 1874 they built the second one, and then they built the third one. But the third one is very important. Why? Because the third one was right after a big riot that actually says Chinese must go. It's their biggest slogan. They really try to kick Chinese out. This event happened in July. The third theater opened in October. So it didn't stop them. It didn't stop them from being, lively and enjoy the cultural production. And I want to just also show who built the third theater. They were the people who built, actually, designed the San Francisco City Hall in 1871. They were the people who built, mansion for Charles Quaker, one of the, magnate of the railroad construction. So Chinese community leaders recruited the top architect to build their theater. And we don't really have a lot of pictures surviving from that time, fortunately. And this is one of the ones that shows this fourth theater that was built in 1879. And this is the inside. You can see the decoration. You can see the name, Chinese names here, English names here. And these are special design and so on and so forth. They have box seat and so on and so forth. Lively, very lively performances. And you can also see the performers depicted in some of the magazines. And this is a real oil painting by an artist whose name is Theodore Ward, and another painter whose name is Cox, paint beautiful pictures of Chinese performers. And they also appear in various different kind of magazines. So let's come back to Canada. So at the same time that those performances were, lively in San Francisco, in Canada it was just as lively, actually, no less lively, I must say. And you can say that it is actually in 1882, the newspaper report of this particular theater is also built specifically for Chinese performances, right? And not only that, you also see that 1885, there's more mentioning in newspaper about the Chinese theaters and their importance. And we also, from the map, can tell that they actually do exist. So I have here marked for you A and B. These are in Victoria, and these A and B are two Chinese theaters. And you can see that they're very lively. So 1913 is the time that this map was made. And this is the compound, basically, of the famous Yat-Sen. And in his compound, he was, as you know, one of the most famous Canadian Chinese who developed such a wealth and influence, and he had a Chinese theater built inside his community. And from his company, later in the 1870s, we uncover some of the materials. These are powder, these are, rouge for performances, and so on and so forth. But that is not all. In 1917, we also have pictures of performers in Peru. And these are also from magazines. You can tell that they are active. So the Chinese opera or Cantonese opera at that time was very extremely lively. And this is a playbill that's actually for Vancouver. So we talk about Victoria, we talk about Lima, we talk about San Francisco. Now we are in Vancouver. Vancouver in the 1910s had 3 theaters, and this is one of them. This is the playbill they print, and there was a series of them that you can find in archive. And we also find that they have a lot of the business paper. You can see that they're having a lot of people who show up. Here's one little report that I share with people about how many tickets were sold. Mind you, this is one of the 3 theaters, okay? And this evening, you can tell that they sold 1,027 tickets. And that was probably to the capacity. And this is one evening that they didn't do so well. but not doing so well means 536 tickets, right? So imagine it's almost like, a important community space that people come and just enjoy themselves. Okay, so this is, again is the next development. So we were talking about 1910s, and then 1920s is this big troupe that happened. And this is from Analyst newspaper. It is the Lowanian's very first newspaper advertisement. It's huge. It takes a whole row like this. And then you can see the performers. One of the performers, Mai Sulan, she was appearing in the middle as part of that crew, and she also was featured in the Toronto Daily Star. This just gives an idea of how lively the community had enjoyed the Cantonese opera in a variety of situations, including both the 1910s situation, which they have 3 theaters, and the 1921 situation where they take up one of the main theater of the mainstream society and then make it their own, right? So they expand outside of Chinese community and still do that. And then they also play an important role in creating a renaissance or a second gold era of Cantonese opera in North America. Why? Because in the United States, it was impossible to have theaters. The Chinese exclusion killed the pipeline of actors, and the fire and earthquake killed everything. So it was up to the Canadian to bring the theater down to them. And at that time, they not only go to San Francisco, they also go to Lima, and goes to show that it was such a lively network. And this is why I'm showing you here. This is Hong Kong that comes over through Honolulu and then going to North America to have a whole network of performers. And then the Canada played yet another important role. Guess what they did? They not only have theater in Vancouver, but also they sent people to have theater in Honolulu, right? So this is a company called Kyohin company. They send people and engage a whole troupe to perform. This is one of the playfield there, and this is the kind of performances they did. So I want to play for you a little bit of my favorite song from that time, and this is from the Li Shifang. She's my idol. I really love her voice. And she also, I made a claim in an article, was responsible in elevating the role of Cantonese opera in China. I made a claim about how she made the Cantonese opera such an important performance performing art in Shanghai, and such that she was compared to the Peking opera performer Lan Fang during that time. And this is goes to show how her record was actually, advertised in the newspaper. And this is actually a newspaper in New York. This is not even in San Francisco. But you can see that at the technology at that time was able to really, print these records, and she recorded a lot, and they were selling really well. Another thing that is important to look at this advertisement is that you can tell it's a fashionable thing to do. So you have in here, you have these women, portraying this kind of domestic ideal of having this gramophone player as well as the performance. Here's a man, and his name is Bai Jurong. He's also extremely famous during that time. Actually, I'm going to play from the beginning. The opening is actually really interesting, the introduction from the instruments. So one of the things that he was very much known for was that he lowered the singing to not so much high pitch or nasal. It actually lowered the whole singing, the production to a more they call it pinghole, and just more like original voice. And that is an important contribution that he had. Okay, so this goes to show lively performances in the 1920s, and here just a quick sampling of some playbills. I'll tell you what they are. The one on the right-hand top is the Portland, and you can see that they have a way to print these playbills. And then in the middle is, as we have seen already, the Lomanian, the one that came from actually Vancouver. And this one is Guofonian, is the one that actually is performing in Honolulu. This Yoni Shang is actually in New York, right? So, and this one, of course, is in San Francisco. And this is not everything yet. We still have the ones in Havana. We have the ones in Boston that we can show. But they were very, very lively, and they were going all over the place. So if you can imagine this on the map, they go from one place and performing the other place, and they bring their repertoire and doing a lot of fascinating, innovative kind of performances. And this then leads to the kind of amateur club. This is an amateur club that's performed in Edmonton, Canada. As you can see, they are very elaborate, and they also put together something that's very much look like a professional. And this is a way for you to kind of appreciate how they were. And I'll show you a few more of the production in the 1920s. And I want to add to say that Cantonese opera, as well as the other Chinese opera genre, normally didn't have stage backdrop like this. So this is a new thing, and I think it's related to the ways in which that they're in North America, right? And they want to have all sorts of different fancy things. And I think Shanghai probably adopt this as well, but not everywhere else. So this is another one that goes to show how they were lively performing the contemporary event. And this is the most bizarre one that I found, which is that you have someone wearing tuxedo and you have someone wearing Ming Dynasty dress, and they somehow make a story that makes this work. So one can only imagine what that story must be like. I can't. And they don't exist because they're playing from the plot line. And this is another one that shows an elaborate setting. So some of these are actually stage prop, right? So it's two-dimensional kind of backdrops. Okay, so those were in the 1920s. And then in 1930, Mei Lanfang himself came to North America, as I mentioned, and he performed in Broadway. It was supposed to be 3 weeks and extended to 5 weeks because it was so lively. And then Macy, the department store Macy, also named a flower after him. And he was just, this is a whole report in New York Times. So he was truly admired during that visit. And this is his welcoming photo for his arrival in San Francisco. And this is the mayor during that time and all the other people, showing how Chinese community really view Cantonese opera, view Chinese opera as a way to help them establish their, prestige with the community. Okay, so up to the 1930s, Chinese theater was the primary performance element, right? So you go to the theater and you watch the performance, the live performance, the only thing. And in 1930s, you start to have sound, right? You have to have radio. So movie becomes something that took people's attention, and then theater that perform, Cantonese opera was not the only thing people get their enjoyment out of. So what did the Chinese performer do? Well, they start to make Cantonese opera films, and this is actually a Grandview film company that was established in San Francisco, and this is one of their movie. It's actually complicated. They established in San Francisco and went back to Hong Kong, and then went back to San Francisco again after the war started. But guess what the story is about? Can you make a good guess? You see the fashionable people, right? And you also see the Chinese performers. It's a story about themselves. So it's a story about Chinese theaters with struggling, to compete with other things that society had to offer, right? So we are very lucky to be able to see a little bit of it. I hope the sound will be good. Let's see. 水哥，中午未啊？你要裝身啊？已經裝好嘢。點啊？叫你做嘢。So this is a ritual they do in the backstage for the deities for theaters. So you can tell the music is not what they perform in the theater. Okay, so that's all we got to see, only little clips. But these are theater performers. So in newspaper, it actually talks about how these theater performers shoot the films, right, in the film set, and then change their clothes and run across several streets and to perform on stage. in a Cantonese opera, right? So they do both. They do both to kind of remain relevant to the community. But what happened when even this is not there anymore? What we have is the Cantonese opera films, and people like this really were important household names for a lot of people who grew up in Chinatown in San Francisco. And one person, Tan Nanqing, was actually a performer in North America. But when she was in North America, she played the leading actor female role. And by the time she's performing in these films, she's playing a kind of comic role. You will see her playing the comic middle-aged woman.
咦，乜係你啊最紅？吓，乜你識嘅家嫂嘅咩？最紅？哦，咁我又明白啦。可恨你兄妹兩人串同來騙我，佢原來係清貧女子，點能共乖仔你定啲呀咯？我要解除婚姻，大好良緣，難錯過。死者保證人係我阿嫂雙啊，錢財問你哋寫一定。
I want to add is that the Chinese films during that time not only have these Cantonese opera film, but also has these, kung fu films. And they were also very much, performed by people who were taken this acrobat in Cantonese opera to perform as a theater. So these became one of the important cultural, production that was kind of shared by different community of Chinese all over North America, right? Because they had the film production and they were shown in various different cities. So I think basically in my book what I wanted to show is that Cantonese opera and also the Chinese theaters were such an important part of Chinese communities. And today we don't really get to learn a lot about them and why. It is for many complicated reasons. But I want to make a claim that the history is there for us to kind of explore and understand with this kind of full-hearted kind of pursuit to see what it must be like for those people to be in the theater and enjoy the music, enjoy the sight, whether it's on the silver screen or whether it's on a real person performing. And we still have a lot of opportunity to understand what it means to have the Chinese theater in the community for all this time. So thank you very much for your time.
These are the two books. You can see that. And so I thank Nancy for giving me the Chinese version. I touched it the first time yesterday. I was kind of really thrilled. I think this is the first copy in Canada. I think. All right. Questions, comments, suggestions, criticisms, anything. Yes?
Well, I just want to know, was the opera, was it affordable for all members of the community to attend, even the poorest members? Would they be able to afford to go? Would they have been allowed in the theater?
Yeah, they would. And in that particular slide, I show the audiences number. We show the different price of the tickets. And very, very luckily, I was actually. So in that one I show the number of people who show up on in each night. You actually show different classes of tickets. So they were affordable. And I also just recently uncovered a very important document that allows me to see that they pay only 10 cents in 1879. And 10 cents is also the amount they pay for a cheap meal. If they want to splurge, they pay 20 cents for a meal. But 10 cents allow them not only to see a show, but also go in and out. So the 18th century, 1870s and 80s was a fascinating time to study. Why? Because they play 3 shows. They play one at 12 o'clock, one at 4 o'clock, and one at 7. So that's how popular they were, it can sustain that. And we of course have the, wealthy people who take the box seat and they are probably, have kind of a subscription just because they're a sponsor or something like that. And they are the wealthy people who enjoy in their own way. But for a theater really to survive, they actually need the mass because we don't have 2,000 wealthy people. We have probably, 100 who can do that, and the rest will buy the cheap ticket. So thank you for the question.
Were there troops that were itinerant, just traveled around from town to town? Were there troops that were attached to a theater that stayed in one place?
That's really a very good question and impossible to answer because we don't know enough about them. But what we always know is that if a theater stay in one place and show the same performers night after night, it's not going to stick very long, right? And this is not like the kind of situation that's sustainable. So they must travel somewhat, right? So that's why I think to have the mining towns that have their own theaters is a good way to support San Francisco. But then San Francisco also has large theaters so they can attract good performers. So they kind of feed off each other, right? And that's another reason I think Vancouver play a central role in, starting the Renaissance of the Renaissance of Cantonese opera in the 1920s. So they do that not just to benefit the U.S., but also for their own sake, right? So at that time, they not only go down south to Seattle and San Francisco to perform, they also go across Canada to perform in Toronto. That's why you saw that actress being featured in Toronto Star, because they were performing there, and they go over to Montreal, and they go down to New York, and they go down to Havana, right? So traveling is very important, but I always think the same way you do, that is to say, there must be some that stick around the base, right? The stable of the performers. So you have people who come around and you have the basic people who perform there. So I would say combination. And one reason I say it's really hard to trace who is where is because the names of the troupe change, and even if the names of the troupe remain the same, the people who perform in that troupe change, right? It's switch from one troupe to the other. So one very important thing in 1920s in San Francisco is that there's this theater called the Mandarin Theater, the other is called the Great China Theater. They're a rivalry, not only because they want to compete in terms of the, money-making opportunities, but also because they represent different political stands. So they really compete with each other. However, one actor may perform for one troupe at a time, one theater at one time, and then go somewhere else, and then come back and become performer for the other theater. So it's very fluid and interesting in that way. Not easy to trace, but we do have some evidences. So thank you for the question.
Other questions? Yeah?
Do any of the more unusual operas survive in terms of the scripts for them? So the ones that mix the contemporary and traditional scenery and people. And then has there been a revival at all of those scripts, or even just Cantonese opera in general in North America?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and it's really interesting to think about how people during that time perform in the mindset that's totally different from our time, right? So when you see this, the Cantonese opera films, you see all these characters, they are performing from a script and a composition that's written out for them. But in the 1920s, they perform based on the kind of plot. So they have plots, and these plots include various different formulaic kind of stock item. So, for example, if two people are going to, express their love for each other, they sing particular type of melodies and accompaniments, and also the setting. And if they are going to, if one hero figure is coming to rescue a woman who's jumping into a river, they have that kind of plot. So a lot of little plot like this become the basic training for the Cantonese opera troupe during that time. So when you come on the scene, it's very famous during that time that they do not need rehearsal for the most part. You come on the scene, and then there's someone called the 开戏师爷, meaning the person who basically a producer and director. He will tell to the performer, you're doing this, you're doing this, you're doing that, and they post something on the backstage to show what each scene is about. So everybody follow that scene, know who to come up and what you should sing. So they give a lot of room for improvisation, and in particular bridging, as you can imagine, one particular formulaic thing with another formulaic thing. It takes a lot of talent to bridge one to the other. So that's the important part of the training. And so for that reason, unfortunately, we don't really have much left. And sometimes I also wonder whether those operas actually do not get to perform more than once or twice. Because some of those pictures you saw, right, or the stage production just seems so fantastic, like so innovative. And it's hard to imagine that they get reproduced again. So very, very fluid in that way. Depends on what the audience needs, and depends on what the sometimes the performers themselves can become 开戏 or become kind of steering a plot. It's either based on a contemporary story or something else. Yeah. So yeah, I wish they leave us more, isn't it? Thank you.
Other questions? Alex.
So our class, Cantonese Music and History 27 at UBC.
I'm sorry, can you be a bit louder?
We recently visited the Museum of Anthropology at UBC, and we learned that there's a very large collection of Cantonese artifacts. And we learned that the performers didn't bring it back to China or HK. Why do you think that is?
I think it's complicated in the sense that they don't necessarily belong to the performers. They're the asset of the troops, I think, a lot of times. And I think the famous performers like Li Xuefang or Bai Jurong that I played the recordings of, they're the true star during that time. And only those true stars bring not only their own wardrobe, but this kind of banner that has their name on it, right? And the table draperies that has their name on it. They are the people who travel. One performer whose name is Huang Xiaofeng. She traveled with 60 boxes of stuff. And she has people who travel with her too. So those are the people who bring their own stuff. And for the rest, then the performer, the theater kind of has to supply that. In fact, Emily will read about this in 大汉公报, and that is around the 1918, there was a theater that was closing up and selling all its goods, right? And not only does it sell, I think, the props and stuff, it also includes wardrobe. So it's part of the asset of the theater. And if you think about how expensive those were, you saw those costumes, right? That's so impressive. They're very expensive. So whether or not a regular performers can can actually afford it is really a question, right? So, yeah, so I think those left here probably because these people either bring it or come and the troupe just decide to keep it here, and there will be a reason for its future use anyhow. So yeah, UBC has the anthropology museum's collection is just phenomenal. Yes.
So after the, I don't know if you know, after the Chinese Exclusion Act comes into effect in 1923, does the physical mobility of the troops, is it affected entering and exiting the country, moving around? Does that become a problem for the performers?
I actually would have to yield it to the future scholar to answer that more fully. From what I can see, I don't think it influenced anyone. I think what happened is that there's an existing kind of practice that's agreed upon. So, for example, the performers would pay $500 tax, the company pay for it. They don't even have to pay it, it's just a bond, right? Bond company will put up 500 for each person, and the person then come in and then perform and then leave, and then the bond is canceled. So through practices like this, the Chinese actors were able to come to the United States to perform. After the 1920s, right? They finally come to agreement to do this, and at the same time, the theater would also be given a quota by the immigration office to say, well, this theater can bring 65, that theater can bring 45, and so on and so forth. It's quite arbitrary, as you can imagine. But they have a way to kind of keep surveillance of the actors who come in and then control the number they come in. So it's very closely watched. So I imagine the same thing if someone does devote time to study it, can probably find in the Canadian side as well. It's just very controlled. Yeah.
But at the same time, I think that with that kind of broad scope, and Emily is kind of like, okay, focus on one newspaper, day after day after day after day after day, just to trace it. And so after the 1920s, I expect that you're going to do the 1910s and the 1930s, right? We talk about that. And that would give us a sense of that kind of disruption and continuity. How would that really affect the daily running of the theater? And that would give us a very regional sense of how the Chinese community sustained itself. Right. That would complement this research.
And that's one thing I was actually mentioning to Heidi yesterday. So one thing that really intrigued me about the Vancouver situation is that the names for the theaters changed so much in the 20s. It changed quite a number of times. And I can't quite understand why. And I didn't really look into that. I figure that there must be a reason for the names change. Because, one thing that's really, I just mentioned that the San Francisco had two theaters. One is Great China, right? And the other is called Mandarin. And guess what? After San Francisco had its Mandarin theater, several years later, Vancouver also has a troupe that is called Mandarin. So, I think these groups kind of work with each other to form alliance. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. Form alliance so everybody share the cost. And Q-Hin Company in Honolulu was getting the best out of the deal because everyone, when they pass Honolulu to return to China, the Q-Hin Company would try to get the best from those returning people to perform in their theater, or they even kind of catch them before they go to the North America. So Q-Hin Company is a fascinating company to study, usually from both for both the American side and the Canadian side, because it's a Canadian company, but then it's controlled and located in the United States territory. So.